She had spent 3 years organizing his empire. It took her 3 seconds to burn it all down. Sofia Moretti stood in the penthouse office of the man who terrified Wall Street, federal prosecutors, and rival crime families across the eastern seaboard. And she looked him dead in the eyes and said no. Not I'll consider it. Not let me reschedule. No. The word landed in the room like a gunshot. Luca De Luca went very still, and Sofia realized with cold clarity pressing against her ribs that she had just done something no one in 3 years had ever dared to do. Drop a like if you want to see how far this goes, and comment the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The rain had been falling since 4 in the afternoon, the kind of steady, indifferent New York rain that didn't care about umbrellas or expensive shoes or the fact that Sofia had a 7 o'clock flight to catch. It hammered the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 43rd floor like it had a personal grievance, streaking the glass in long silver lines that blurred the Manhattan skyline into something impressionistic and cold. Sofia didn't look at the windows. She was looking at her screen, fingers moving across the keyboard with the focused speed of someone who had learned very early in this job that hesitation cost you. 3 years of working for Luca De Luca had done that to her. Stripped hesitation out of her like a surgeon removing something unnecessary. You moved fast, you anticipated, you solved problems before he knew they existed, and you did not, under any circumstances, let him see you scramble. Her desk was organized down to the millimeter. Pending contracts stacked on the left, signed documents on the right. The small leather-bound calendar she still kept by hand, sitting open to today's date, with 2 words written in her neat, controlled print at the bottom of the page. Elena's wedding. She had circled it in red ink 6 weeks ago. She had submitted the leave request 8 weeks before that. Approved. Marcus had confirmed it himself. Marcus Chen, Luca's head of operations, who ran the legitimate side of the De Luca empire with the efficiency of a Swiss watch and the warmth of a tax audit. Even Marcus, who approved nothing without first calculating its cost, had signed off on her 4 days away. 4 days. Miami. Her sister's wedding. Sofia glanced at the clock. 6:14 p.m. She needed to leave by 6:45 to make her flight with any margin. Her bag was already packed, sitting in the trunk of the car downstairs. She had reorganized tomorrow's morning briefings to run without her, pre-drafted responses to the 3 contracts that needed attention before Monday, and written a 12-page handover document that covered every active project with enough detail that a reasonably intelligent person could manage things for 4 days without her. She had thought of everything. What she had not thought of was that Luca would call an emergency operations meeting at 5:47 p.m. on a Friday. The summons had come through Marcus, brief and toneless as everything Marcus communicated. Mr. De Luca requires your presence. Penthouse conference room. Now. Sofia had stared at that message for exactly 4 seconds before picking up her phone and walking to the elevator. The penthouse conference room occupied the northeast corner of the building's top floor, separated from Luca's private office by a short corridor and a set of double doors that were always kept closed. The room had 12 leather chairs around an oval table made from some dark wood that probably had a name she didn't know, and a wall of windows that looked out over the city like a throne room surveying its territory. When she walked in, 4 men were already seated. Marco Vitale, Luca's consigliere, silver-haired and watchful, his fingers laced on the table in front of him. Danny Reese, the organization's head of security, built like someone had stacked 2 refrigerators on top of each other and taught them to wear a suit. James Holt, the CFO of De Luca Enterprises, who looked perpetually like he had just received bad news and was deciding whether to share it. And Marcus, standing near the window with his tablet, not sitting, which meant he expected this to run long. Luca stood at the head of the table. I was in his shirt sleeves, jacket discarded somewhere, tie loosened 2 inches, which, for Luca De Luca, was the equivalent of another man wearing a bathrobe. He had the kind of build that expensive suits disguised and shirt sleeves revealed, broad shoulders, lean through the waist, the kind of physical presence that came from years of being the most dangerous person in every room he entered. His hair was dark, slightly longer than a conventional businessman would wear it, and his jaw carried 2 days of stubble that wasn't vanity or affectation. He simply hadn't slept enough this week to bother with it. I was looking at a set of documents spread across the table, and he didn't look up when Sofia entered. "Close the door," he said. She closed it. "Sit." She sat. Not because she didn't resent the command, but because she had learned to pick her battles. She placed her phone face up on the table in front of her where she could see the clock, and she folded her hands and waited. Luca finally looked up. His eyes moved to her phone, then to her face, and something shifted in his expression that she couldn't quite read. Not irritation, something more complicated than irritation. The Marchetti deal is accelerating, he said. They want to close by Wednesday. That means we need a full due diligence packet assembled over the weekend, financial projections, compliance documentation, property assessments for the 3 Newark warehouses, and a revised partnership structure that removes the liability clause their lawyers flagged on Thursday. Sophia kept her voice neutral. That's a significant amount of work for a weekend turnaround, which is why I'm telling you now instead of Monday morning. He looked back at the documents. I need you coordinating directly with Holt's team and the Newark property managers. I also need you to reschedule the Tuesday board meeting, push it to Thursday to give us room after the Wednesday close. The clock on her phone read 6:19. I'm not available this weekend, Sophia said. The room went quiet in a particular way. Not the quiet of people waiting for the next thing to happen, but the quiet of people who had just heard something that didn't quite compute. Marcus looked up from his tablet. Holt stopped moving the pen he'd been turning between his fingers. Even Danny, who expressed approximately 2 emotions and usually managed neither convincingly, went still. Luca looked at her. His expression didn't change. That was the thing about Luca DeLuca that people misread. They expected visible anger, expected the temperature of the room to drop or rise on a clear signal. What actually happened when something crossed him was nothing. Perfect stillness. The kind of stillness that came from a man who had learned, in environments far more dangerous than a boardroom, that reaction was information you gave to your enemies for free. What did you say? He asked. His voice was quiet. I said, I'm not available this weekend. Sophia kept her spine straight, her voice even, and her eyes on his. I submitted a leave request 10 weeks ago. It was approved. I have a flight leaving tonight at 8:15 for Miami. My sister is getting married on Saturday, and I am not missing it. The silence that followed lasted approximately 5 seconds. It felt considerably longer. Reschedule your flight, Luca said. It wasn't a request. It wasn't even really an instruction. It was the verbal equivalent of a door closing. No. The word came out clean and flat and irreversible. Sophia felt it leave her mouth, and she felt the air pressure in the room change around it, like something had shifted in the building's foundation, and she thought very clearly, there it is, that's the line, you've crossed it. Moretti. His voice had dropped. Not to a shout. Luca DeLuca did not shout. That would have been easier to survive. His voice had dropped to something lower and more controlled, which meant the temperature had lowered too. This is not a request I'm making. This is a business requirement. The Marchetti deal is worth $40 million, and it cannot wait. Then assign it to someone else, she said. I left handover documentation on the server this afternoon. Marcus has access to everything. Holt's team knows the financials better than I do. This is manageable without me for 4 days. I'm not asking your opinion on what's manageable. I know you're not. She kept her voice steady. You never ask my opinion on anything, Mr. DeLuca. You issue instructions and you expect compliance, and for 3 years you've gotten it. But my leave was approved. I have a legal right to time off, and I am not... She paused, just briefly, just enough to make it deliberate. Canceling my sister's wedding to write a due diligence packet. Marco cleared his throat, very quietly, and angled himself almost imperceptibly away from the table, as though trying to become part of the wall. Marcus had stopped looking at his tablet entirely. Holt was studying the grain of the table with intense concentration. Luca moved. He picked up the documents he'd been reviewing, straightened them against the table surface with one controlled tap, and set them down. His eyes had not left her face. You work for me, he said. I do, Sophia agreed, and I have done that job exceptionally well for 3 years, including nights and weekends and holidays you never acknowledged. I have earned 4 days off for my sister's wedding, and I'm taking them. If you walk out of this room tonight, you're not walking back in. The threat landed. She felt it land, felt it in her chest, in the sudden tightness across her shoulders, in the faint unsteadiness that ran through her hands before she pressed them flat against the table and willed it gone. Because this was the calculation she had not quite made until this moment. She had been so focused on standing her ground that she hadn't fully mapped out where the ground ended. Fired. He was telling her she would be fired. 3 years of her life. The salary that paid her apartment, her mother's medical bills, her own accumulated savings for the future she'd been quietly planning, the career she'd built, the reputation she'd earned, the network she'd cultivated entirely within the DeLuca organization, because that was the only world that had ever moved fast enough to keep her interested. All of it, suspended on the word she'd already said. No. Sophia picked up her phone from the table. She stood up. The chair made no sound as it moved back because the carpet in this room was so thick it absorbed everything. Then I won't, she said. She was at the door when his voice came again, and this time something in it was different. Not softer exactly, but different. Something she couldn't name, something that almost sounded like it cost him something to say. Moretti. She stopped. Her hand was on the door handle. She didn't turn around. Think carefully about what you're doing. She turned around then. She looked at him across the length of the conference table with the rain hammering the windows behind him and the four men around the table, all looking somewhere that wasn't her face, and she thought, I've been thinking carefully for 3 years. This is the first impulsive thing I've done in this building. I have, she said. Have a good weekend, Mr. DeLuca. She walked out. The elevator doors opened immediately, like the building had been waiting for her. She stepped in and turned and pressed lobby, and for the 3 seconds before the doors closed, she could see straight down the corridor to the double doors of the conference room, still closed. He did not come out. The doors shut. The elevator descended. Sophia stood very still and breathed. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them against her thighs and breathed and told herself it was adrenaline. It was just adrenaline. The body's response to conflict, to the animal part of the brain that had registered threat the moment Luca DeLuca stopped moving and fixed those dark eyes on her face and went completely still. It was adrenaline. She was fine. The lobby came up. The doors opened. The night security guard looked up from his desk and started to say something. Probably the standard good evening, Ms. Moretti, that everyone in this building had been trained to deliver. And she walked past him with a small wave and pushed through the revolving door into the wet, indifferent, wonderful Manhattan night. The rain hit her immediately. She stood on the sidewalk with the rain soaking into her blazer and looked up at the 43rd floor of the DeLuca building, the conference room windows, the diffused light behind the glass, and she thought, you just quit your job. No. He fired her. He said she wouldn't walk back in. Same difference. She flagged a cab. The flight to Miami was unremarkable. Sophia drank 1 glass of wine she didn't taste, stared out the window at the cloud cover below, and refused to look at her phone except once to text her sister, on my way, see you tomorrow. Elena had responded with 4 exclamation points and an image of the venue decorated with fairy lights, and Sophia had smiled at her phone with something that felt genuine and full and entirely separate from the tightening in her chest every time she thought about the 43rd floor. She didn't think about the 43rd floor. She was very disciplined about this. The hotel was a mid-range place in South Beach that Elena had chosen because it had a rooftop pool and reasonable rates, and a room block for the wedding party. Sophia's room smelled like synthetic jasmine and ocean air, and was entirely, blissfully ordinary. She hung up the dress she'd brought for the ceremony, emerald green, fitted at the waist, the kind of dress she owned 3 versions of in different colors because it worked, and she brushed her teeth and stood in front of the bathroom mirror for a long time before she did anything else. Her face looked the same. That was somehow surprising. She'd half expected to look different, like the version of herself who had just walked out of a penthouse conference room after 3 years should look different from the version who'd walked in. She looked exactly the same. Dark hair pulled back, brown eyes with the slight hollowing underneath that came from chronic undersleep, the small scar above her left eyebrow from a fall at 11 that she'd always been too vain to get properly faded. You just burned down 3 years of your life, she thought. Then she turned the light off and went to bed. Elena Moretti got married on Saturday afternoon in a courtyard filled with white flowers and rented bistro lights, and 43 guests who laughed too loud during the cocktail hour and cried at all the right moments during the ceremony. The groom was a man named Peter Calloway, who was demonstrably in love with her sister in the uncomplicated, open-faced way that some people managed, the way Sophia had always observed from a slight distance, like watching a film in a language she almost spoke. Sophia stood at the front of the bridal party in her emerald dress and held Elena's bouquet during the vows and did not cry, which was not about emotional suppression so much as the fact that she had always processed large feelings on a delay, stored them somewhere interior, and returned to them later when the room was quiet. She smiled. She toasted her sister at the reception with a speech that made Elena laugh until she had to press her napkin to her eyes. She danced twice, drank champagne she actually tasted this time, and sat at a corner table late in the evening with her heels off and her feet on the empty chair beside her, watching Elena and Peter on the dance floor. It was past midnight when she looked at her phone. She had been carefully not doing that since she landed. But it was past midnight and the wedding was over and she was no longer protecting the day from the outside world. 22 missed calls. 11 from Marcus, 4 from Holt. 3 from a number she didn't recognize. The remaining 4 from a number she recognized very well. Luca's direct line. The one he used for calls that bypassed his assistant routing because he didn't want a record of who he'd contacted. 11 emails from Marcus. 2 from the DeLuca Enterprises legal team. 1 text from a number with no name saved that said only, "When you're back. We need to talk." She stared at that text for a long time. When you're back. Not if. Not you're terminated, please collect your personal items. Not even the formal HR notification she would have expected. When you're back. She set the phone face down on the table and looked at Elena still dancing, lit up and uncomplicated and happy. Sophia thought, when I'm back. She thought, back to what? She gave herself until Sunday evening. Sunday evening, sitting in Miami International's Terminal D with a boarding pass and a carry-on, and the specific low-grade exhaustion of someone who had spent a weekend feeling two contradictory things at once. She opened her laptop and began methodically to assess the damage. The Marchetti due diligence, she discovered, had been partially assembled. Marcus had clearly pulled in 2 of Holt's junior analysts over the weekend, working from her handover notes. The work was incomplete and imprecise in the ways she expected from people who didn't know the files as well as she did, but it was not a disaster. The Wednesday close was still theoretically achievable with 2 solid days of work. The Tuesday board meeting had not been rescheduled. That would be a problem. The Newark property assessments had not been touched. She closed the laptop. She thought about the text. When you're back. She had spent the last 2 days telling herself she was fine with what she'd done, that she'd made the right call, that no job was worth canceling a wedding for, that Luca DeLuca's needs were not the organizing principle of her life, that she had been letting his world colonize every available space for 3 years, and she had been right to say no. She still believed all of that. What she couldn't quite account for was the feeling underneath it, the one she'd been storing in that interior space since Friday night. She retrieved it now, in the fluorescent noise of the departure terminal, and examined it with honest attention. It wasn't relief. It wasn't triumph. It was something more uncomfortable than either of those. She missed it, not him. She was disciplined enough with herself to be precise about this. Not Luca specifically, not the way he looked at documents, or the particular quiet of his office at 7 in the morning when she arrived before anyone else, and the whole organization existed, briefly, in a kind of potential stillness before it became itself. Not him, the work, the pace of it, the way every morning presented a set of genuinely complex problems that required her entire brain to solve, and the clean satisfaction at the end of each day of knowing she had solved them. 3 years of that, of being essential in the most complete sense of the word, not appreciated, not praised, not acknowledged in any way that resembled warmth, but genuinely, structurally necessary. The kind of necessary that Luca DeLuca expressed not through gratitude, but through the fact that he handed her every problem that mattered. She was aware that this was not healthy. She had been aware of it for approximately 3 years. Her flight boarded. She put in her earbuds, stared out the window as the Miami lights fell away into the dark, and thought about what she was going back to. She arrived at her apartment at 11:40 p.m., Sunday. She showered, unpacked methodically, and sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea. She let go cold, thinking about nothing in particular with the deliberate blankness she used when she needed to make a decision and wasn't ready to make it yet. At 8:04 Monday morning, her phone rang. Not Marcus. Not the unknown number. Not Holt. Luca. She stared at his name on the screen through 3 full rings. Then she answered. Moretti. His voice was exactly as she remembered it. Controlled. Precise. Nothing wasted. Mr. DeLuca. A pause. Short, but long enough that she registered it as unusual. I need to see you, he said, this morning. I don't work for you, she said. You made that fairly clear on Friday. Another pause. This one longer. She could hear faintly the city sounds behind him. He was somewhere mobile, not the office. "Come to the building," he said. "If you want to hear what I have to say, come at 10. If you don't, I won't contact you again." He ended the call. Sophia set the phone on the table and looked at it. "If you don't, I won't contact you again." Which meant he had something to say that wasn't just an expectation of return, something he had decided on, or been pushed into deciding on, over a weekend that had apparently, if 22 missed calls were any evidence, not gone entirely according to plan without her. She told herself she was going for practical reasons. She had left things unfinished. The Marchetti deal, the Newark assessments, professional closure. The kind of person she was did not leave work half done, regardless of what had happened between her and the person who'd commissioned it. She told herself that. She put on her best blazer, charcoal, fitted, the one she wore when she needed to feel armored, and left the apartment at 9:38. The lobby security greeted her with the usual, "Good morning, Ms. Moretti," which was either a sign that Luca had not yet communicated her termination to the building staff or a sign that no one had been told anything official. Both were possible. Both were interesting. Marcus was waiting by the elevator bank. Not a good sign. Marcus waiting anywhere was not a casual occurrence. "He's in his office," Marcus said. He handed her a manila folder. "The Marchetti projections. I finished the narrative section last night." Sophia took the folder. "You did this yourself?" There was no one else who knew the files. He paused. Not a Marcus pause, which was usually computational. This one had something more human in it. "The Tuesday board meeting has been moved to Thursday. I hope that's acceptable." "You did that too?" Someone had to. She looked at him. Marcus Chen, who ran operations with the warmth of a tax audit, was looking at her with something that was as close to an expression as Marcus usually allowed himself. "He didn't sleep Friday or Saturday," Marcus said. Very quietly, very precisely, like a man reading from a document rather than offering an observation. "He fired 2 people on Sunday, then reinstated them. He reviewed your handover document 4 times that I counted. He had me call you 11 times, which, as you may be aware, is 11 times more than he has ever asked me to call anyone." Sophia processed this. "I'm not telling you what to do," Marcus added. "That would be presumptuous. I'm providing information." "Right," she said. "The elevator's here." She got in the elevator. The 43rd floor looked exactly the same. Of course it did. It had been 2 days. The carpet, the dark wood, the specific ambient temperature of a building where someone paid attention to HVAC. Her desk sat exactly as she'd left it on Friday, the leather calendar still open to the circled date with Elena's wedding written at the bottom. Luca's office door was open. She stood in the doorway. I was at his desk, jacket on, unusual for this early, standing rather than sitting, looking out at the rain-streaked windows with his back to her. He knew she was there. Luca de Luca always knew when someone was in a room. "Close the door," he said. She closed it. He turned around. He looked at her for a moment without speaking, and she had the sudden, disorienting experience of looking at a man she had studied for 3 years and seeing something she hadn't seen before. Something around the eyes, around the jaw. Not vulnerability. That was too simple a word for whatever it was. Something that looked more like a man who had not slept and had spent the sleepless time arriving at a conclusion that had cost him something to reach. "Sit down, Sophia." He had never called her by her first name. Not once in 3 years. Not once. She sat down. He sat down across from her, not at his desk, but at the small table near the windows where they occasionally reviewed documents face to face when the material required it. He set a single sheet of paper on the table between them. "That's a contract," he said. "Chief of Operations. DeLuca Enterprises, legitimate division. 40% salary increase from your current rate, an equity share in the holdings portfolio, and full executive authority over company operations." He paused. "I want you to read it." Sophia looked at the contract. She did not pick it up. "I owe you an apology," Luca said. The words landed in the room with the same quality as her no had landed on Friday, like something that changed the atmospheric pressure. "For Friday," she said carefully. "For Friday, and—" He stopped. A short stop, the kind that meant he was choosing language precisely. "For the pattern of behavior Friday was part of. You have worked for this organization with exceptional competence for 3 years. I have not acknowledged that adequately. I have," another stop, "treated you as a resource. That was a mistake." Sophia looked at him. At the set of his jaw and the controlled stillness of his hands, flat on the table, and the way his eyes met hers without deflecting. Luca De Luca apologizing was not a thing she had ever imagined, not because she doubted he was capable of error, but because she doubted he was capable of naming it. "This is the contract you're offering," she said. "Chief of Operations." "Yes." "And the apology is what? Separate from the business offer?" He looked at her. "Yes." "You're not apologizing to get me back." "I'm asking you to come back," he said very precisely, "because this organization needs you. And I am apologizing because I owe you an apology. They are related, but not the same thing." She picked up the contract. She read it carefully. Every line. She was aware of him watching her with that particular Luca De Luca quality of attention that was not patience exactly, but something more like absolute focus. The way he looked at anything he considered important. The contract was real. It was generous. The equity share alone represented a kind of institutional acknowledgement she had spent 3 years working toward without ever believing she'd receive. She set it back down. "I'll think about it," she said. Something crossed his face, almost imperceptible, but she was very good by now at reading things on Luca De Luca's face that he intended to keep there. "Fair enough," he said. She stood. She picked up the Marchetti folder she'd carried up from Marcus. She set it on the table between them. "The Wednesday close is still achievable," she said. "The narrative section is complete. You need the Newark assessments before noon tomorrow and a revised partnership structure by Tuesday evening. If you have someone capable of managing the revision, it's doable." He looked at the folder, then at her. "The board meeting is Thursday," she added. "Marcus handled the reschedule." "I know," Luca said. "I'll let you know about the contract by end of day Tuesday." She picked up her bag. She walked to the door. She had her hand on the handle, the same configuration as Friday, same door, same exit, same hand on the same handle, when he spoke. "Sophia." She stopped. "Your sister," he said. "The wedding, how was it?" She turned around. He was still sitting at the table, the contract between his hands, looking at her with that expression she still didn't have a word for. "It was beautiful," she said. She opened the door and walked out. And this time she didn't look back at the conference room. And this time the building felt different, or she felt different inside it, which was maybe the same thing. And in the elevator going down, she pressed her hand flat against the metal wall and felt the vibration of the city all around her and thought, "He called you Sophia. He said he owes you an apology. He offered you equity." And underneath all of that, quiet and specific, as a current beneath still water, something else was moving. Something she had been careful not to name for 3 years. Something she had organized away and structured away and professionalized into the furthest corner of herself. Something that had nonetheless been there, occupying space, the whole time. She thought about the way he'd looked at her. Not the CEO looking at an employee. Not the boss reviewing a performance problem. Something else. Something she was not ready to examine in an elevator at 10:45 on a Monday morning. The lobby came up. She walked out into the gray Manhattan mid-morning. She had until Tuesday evening to make a decision about the contract. What she didn't know yet was that the contract was the least complicated decision she was going to have to make. Because on Tuesday morning, a man named Adrian Cross would walk into De Luca Enterprises for his first day as the organization's new strategic expansion consultant. Handsome, articulate, and carrying a briefcase full of plans that had nothing to do with the legitimate business portfolio and everything to do with the precise, targeted destruction of a very specific life. Sophia's life. Or more accurately, the life she was just beginning, quietly, in the very marrow of herself, to imagine with Luca De Luca in it. Adrian Cross arrived on a Tuesday. He arrived the way certain men always arrive in rooms they've already decided belong to them, with easy confidence and a handshake that lasted exactly the right amount of time, not a half second too long, not a fraction too short. He was 34, lean through the jaw, with the kind of face that photographed well and communicated nothing specific in person. Medium height. Dark suit, not as expensive as Luca's, but expensive enough to signal that he understood the language. Hair that sat perfectly without appearing to have been arranged. Sophia noticed him the way she noticed everything, with the practiced peripheral attention of someone whose job had trained her to catalog every new element entering the environment. She had signed the contract that morning. She had signed it at 8:47 a.m. at her kitchen table with a pen she'd had for 6 years and a cup of coffee going cold at her elbow, and she had done it with the focused deliberateness of someone who had already made the decision 3 days earlier and was only now executing it. The signature had looked the same as every other signature she'd made on every other document she'd processed in 3 years. Clean, decisive, the handwriting of someone who had stopped second-guessing their own choices. She'd brought the signed contract upstairs and left it on Marcus's desk before 9, which meant Marcus had it before Luca arrived, which meant Luca had it before he walked into the morning briefing, which meant when he looked at her across the conference table at 9:15, he already knew. He hadn't said anything, just looked at her, a fraction of a second longer than professional, and then looked at the agenda sheet in front of him and started the briefing. She was chief of operations as of today. It felt like standing on new terrain that looked exactly like the old terrain, but had a different geological structure beneath it. The ground was familiar, the foundation had shifted. Adrian Cross had been introduced at the end of that briefing by Marcus, who explained with characteristic economy that Mr. Cross had been contracted to develop and implement a strategic expansion framework for the legitimate business portfolio over the next 18 months. He'd worked previously with 3 mid-size holding companies on similar mandates. He had an MBA and a track record that Marcus had verified personally, which meant Marcus had gone 3 levels deep into the verification and found nothing concerning. Adrian had stood up, scanned the room, and smiled. His eyes had landed on Sophia for slightly longer than the others. Not aggressively, just with the specific attentiveness of a man who notices women and doesn't particularly try to hide that he does. She had looked back at him with the flat professional attention she gave everyone and moved on. That was Tuesday. By Thursday, she knew he was good at his job. He presented the first phase of his expansion framework to her and Marcus in the third-floor conference room, and it was thorough, analytically sound, and built on 3 weeks of research he'd conducted before even setting foot in the building. He asked sharp questions. He listened to the answers without performing listening. He actually processed what was said and adjusted his next question accordingly, which was rarer than it should have been at this level. She found it professionally interesting. That was the full extent of it. By the following Tuesday, she knew he was also, deliberately and with increasing directness, interested in her. It had started with small things. The way he positioned himself in shared meetings, not beside her, not across from her, but at an angle that meant he was always in her peripheral line of sight. The way he found reasons to stop at her office door 2 or 3 times a day, questions that were genuine but could have been sent by email. The way when she answered, he gave her his full attention with a quality that was warm rather than purely professional. She was not unaware of this. She was also not particularly moved by it. What she was aware of, in a way that required her to exercise her most disciplined internal management, was Luca. The 2 weeks since she'd signed the contract had done something to the building's atmosphere that she could not have precisely defined but could not ignore. Luca had kept his word about the promotion. Her authority over operational decisions was real and unambiguous. When she made calls, they held. He had kept his word about respect. When she offered analysis in meetings, he listened with a quality of attention that was different from how he'd listened before. And in the 2 instances where she and Marco had disagreed on approach, Luca had sided with her. But it was the small things that were harder to manage. The way he had started arriving earlier. She'd always come in at 7 a.m. when the office was quiet, and for 3 years she'd had that hour to herself. Now twice in the last week, she'd stepped out of the elevator at 7:02 to find his office light already on and the faint sound of him on a call, and the knowledge that he was there in the building before her did something to the quality of the early morning quiet that was not entirely professional. The way he'd asked about her sister, twice now. How is Elena settling in? Did she get the issue with the venue deposit sorted? Which meant he had remembered not just the wedding, but a logistical detail she'd mentioned in passing during a call about something else entirely. Luca did not retain irrelevant details, which meant it had not been irrelevant. And the way, 3 days ago, she'd been working late on the Marchetti post-close documentation, and he'd come into her office at 9:30 p.m. with 2 cups of coffee. Not asked if she wanted one, not sent it with anyone, just appeared with 2 cups and set one on her desk and said, "You've been here since 7, with a tone that was not a criticism and was not a compliment, and landed somewhere in the middle of both, and then stood there for a moment while she tried to think of something professionally appropriate to say, and then he'd said, "Good work on the Newark assessments," and left. She had sat with the coffee for 15 minutes before she touched it. Good work. From Luca, those 2 words were the operational equivalent of a standing ovation from anyone else. She knew this was dangerous territory. She had cataloged it, labeled it, and was actively managing it the way she managed every other complex variable in her professional life. With structure and discipline and the firm understanding that what she thought she might be feeling was, in all likelihood, the psychological residue of 3 years of close professional intensity mislabeled as something personal. She was managing it fine. Then Adrian Cross asked her to lunch. It was Friday, midday, the kind of end-of-week midday when the building exhaled slightly and people moved between floors with less urgency. He appeared at her office door with his jacket on and a straightforward expression. "Lunch," he said. "I want to walk you through the Phase 2 proposal before I present it formally. There's a place 2 blocks over." She looked up from her screen. Assessed. It was a legitimate working lunch. She knew the Phase 2 presentation was scheduled for Monday, and it was reasonable to want her feedback before it went to the full room. Marcus had done the same thing with her for years. 45 minutes, she said. Perfect. The restaurant was the kind of mid-range Italian place that Manhattan had in abundance. Good bread, reasonable noise level, tables that weren't packed together like sardines. They ordered quickly, and Adrian opened the proposal on his laptop and walked her through it with the same focused efficiency he brought to everything. The proposal was good. She told him so, and flagged 3 areas where she thought the projected returns were optimistic relative to the current portfolio structure. And he took notes and asked follow-up questions, and at no point did any of it feel like anything other than a working lunch. Until the end, when the check came and he was closing his laptop and he said, without particular fanfare, "I'd like to do this again." Not necessarily working. Sophia looked at him. "I appreciate the directness," she said. "I find it more efficient." "I'm not in a position for personal complications," she said. "I've just taken on a new role. The focus is on the work." He looked at her with the same attentive, processing quality he brought to everything. Not hurt, not pushed back, just assessing. "Understood," he said. "For now." The "for now" was noted. She filed it. They walked back to the building. In the lobby, she pressed the elevator button and Adrian said, "Whatever that is between you and DeLuca, you should decide what you want it to be before someone else decides for you." And then the elevator opened and he stepped in with a small nod. And she stood in the lobby for 5 seconds after the doors closed, very still. Whatever that is between you and DeLuca. She told herself he was perceptive in the way that strategically intelligent people sometimes were about power dynamics. That he had read the room, read the organization, and made a calculation. That it didn't mean there was anything observable, that she had been careful. She pressed the elevator button again. Behind her, across the lobby, she had no way of knowing that a man who had been standing near the security desk for the last 6 minutes, a man she hadn't noticed because he was deliberately unnoticeable, in the way of people who made a professional habit of it, had photographed both her and Adrian Cross leaving the building together at 12:08, returning at 12:53, and captured the specific geometry of their lobby conversation with a long lens from a very careful angle. She had no way of knowing that. She got in the elevator and went back to work. It was Marcus who told her, at 6:17 that evening, that Luca had canceled his 6 p.m. standing review meeting without rescheduling. Marcus said this the way he said most things, with the factual tone of a man reporting weather conditions. But the specific way he said it, while looking at his tablet rather than at her, was the kind of Marcus tell she had learned to read over 2 years. "He canceled it himself?" she asked. "Yes." "Did something come up?" "Not that I've been informed of." A pause. "He was in his office most of the afternoon." Another pause, even shorter. With the exception of approximately 45 minutes beginning around 1 o'clock, during which he appeared to be on the 41st floor. The 41st floor was where the building's internal monitoring systems were managed, which included the lobby security cameras. Sophia absorbed this with the controlled stillness she had learned from 3 years of proximity to a man who used controlled stillness as a weapon. "Thank you, Marcus," she said. She packed up her desk. She rode the elevator down. She got into the black car that had been part of her new contract arrangement and sat in the back seat as it pulled into the Friday evening grid of midtown traffic, and she stared out the window at the yellow light, and she thought about the specific way Luca DeLuca went still when he was processing something he didn't like. He checked the cameras. She felt anger move through her, clean and sharp and very specific, because she had done nothing wrong. She had gone to a working lunch with a colleague and been asked a question she had answered with professional clarity, and that was the complete sum of what had happened. She owed no explanation. She was not his, in any sense that entitled him to check cameras or cancel meetings or do whatever it was he was doing right now in his 43rd floor office. But underneath the anger, honest and unwelcome, was something else. He had checked the cameras. Luca De Luca, who ran a criminal empire without showing emotional response to any of it, had spent 45 minutes on the 41st floor looking at lobby footage of her and Adrian Cross. She pressed her fingers against the car window and felt the cold through the glass. Whatever that is between you and De Luca. She went in early Monday. He was already there. His office light was on at 6:55 a.m. when she stepped off the elevator, and his door was half open, which it usually wasn't when he was on calls. She put her bag at her desk, got coffee from the kitchen, and stood at her window for exactly 5 minutes before she picked up her coffee and walked to his door. She knocked on the open frame. He was at his desk, jacket on, looking at his screen. He looked up. "I need 5 minutes," she said. "Sit down." She sat down. She put her coffee on the edge of his desk and she looked at him directly, the way she had in the conference room when she'd said no to him, and she said, "The lunch on Friday was a working meeting, Phase 2 review ahead of this morning's presentation. It was professional." He looked at her. His expression was completely controlled. The control itself was the tell. "I didn't ask," he said. "You checked the lobby cameras." Something moved across his face. The smallest thing. A tension around the jaw, quickly resettled. He didn't confirm and didn't deny, which was its own confirmation. "I have concerns about Cross," he said. "His background, while technically clean, has Luca." She said his name, first time. She watched him register it. "If you have professional concerns about Adrian Cross, I will review them. That's my job. But if you were on the 41st floor on Friday for any other reason, I need you to say that." He was very still. "You're my chief of operations," he said. "I have a responsibility to—" "That is not what I asked." The silence between them was not the silence of a man choosing words. It was the silence of a man standing at the edge of something he had not decided whether to cross. Then his phone rang. Not a personal line, the main line, which meant it had come through the building's routing system, which meant it was flagged as urgent by whoever had put it through, which meant he had to answer it. He held her gaze for 1 second more, then picked up. "De Luca." He listened. His face changed, the slight shift she'd learned to read as the transition from whatever personal thing was happening to business, the door closing inside him between the two registers. "When did this come in?" He was quiet again. "Get Marco on the phone, yes, now." He looked at her and said quietly, hand not yet covering the receiver, "This isn't finished." "No," she agreed. She picked up her coffee and walked out and stood at her own desk and breathed. "This isn't finished." She was still thinking about those words at 10:30 a.m. when Adrian Cross walked into the Monday presentation, set up his materials, and presented a Phase 2 framework that was so clean and thorough that even Marco offered measured approval. And she noticed, from her seat 3 chairs down from Luca, that Luca was not watching the presentation. I was watching Adrian Cross. Not the presentation, not the slides, not the financials, not the 3-phase timeline that Marcus had already approved structurally. He was watching Adrian Cross. The way a man watches something he has already decided is a threat, and is now simply accumulating evidence to confirm what he already knows. Sophia was watching Luca watch Adrian, which meant she was not watching the presentation either, and at some point she became aware that Marco was watching her watch Luca, and the whole room had this layered quality of attention that had nothing to do with Phase 2 expansion frameworks and everything to do with the specific geometry of 4 people in a room who all understood, in different ways, that something had shifted. Adrian finished the presentation. Questions followed, technical, operational, the kind that Marco favored. Adrian answered them with the same composed precision he brought to everything. His eyes moved to Sophia twice during the Q&A, both times legitimately, both times with questions attached, and both times she felt rather than saw Luca go incrementally more still in her peripheral vision. The meeting ended at 11:45. People filed out. Marcus gathered his materials. Marco said something to Luca near the window that Sophia didn't catch, and Luca responded with 2 words she also didn't catch. And then Marco left, and it was just the 2 of them in the conference room with the cleared table between them and the Manhattan mid-morning pressing gray against the windows. Luca looked at her. He's good, she said, because the professional acknowledgement was accurate, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. The framework is solid. I flagged 3 projection issues in our Friday review, and he addressed all 3 in today's presentation. You reviewed it with him privately. That is my job. Before it came to the full room. Also my job. She kept her voice even. I'm chief of operations. Reviewing strategic proposals before they reach executive level is precisely what that role requires. He crossed his arms. Not aggressively. It was a thinking posture, a containment posture, the way he held himself when something was moving inside him that he was not yet ready to let out. I want his background re-verified, he said, deeper than Marcus went. On what basis? Instinct. That's not sufficient basis for, it's sufficient for me. His voice had the flat, final quality it got when he was done discussing something, and she felt the old reflex, the one she'd spent 3 years building and 2 weeks trying to reconstruct. The reflex that said, this is where you stop pushing. She felt it, and she did not follow it. Luca. There it was again, his name in her mouth, that small detonation. She watched him absorb it. If you want a deeper background check on Cross, I will initiate it. But I need you to be honest with me about what you're actually looking for. I told you, instinct. Is the instinct professional or personal? The room went quiet. Not the conference room quiet of people choosing words. The specific pressurized quiet of 2 people who have just arrived at the true subject of a conversation they've been circling for 2 weeks. He uncrossed his arms. He looked at her for a long moment with those dark, controlled eyes, and she held the look and did not glance away. Both, he said. It was the most honest thing he had said to her in 3 years. Maybe the most honest thing she had heard him say to anyone. Okay, she said, carefully. Then you need to understand that lunch on Friday was work. And you need to understand that if it had been something else, if it had been personal, that would be my decision to make, not yours, because I am not yours to manage. He looked like she'd said something that hit a bruise. Not angry, something more interior than angry. I know that, he said, quietly. Good. She picked up her folder. She walked to the door. She stopped because there was something else that needed saying, and she was done, she had decided, with leaving things half said in this building. I appreciate what you said last week, she told him, without turning around. The apology. It was real, and I heard it. But you cannot say you respect my autonomy and then spend 45 minutes checking cameras. Those 2 things don't live in the same place. She left before he could respond. She heard him say her name, Sophia, just as the door closed behind her, and she kept walking, and she told herself the way her pulse was behaving was just the residue of confrontation, and not the sound of a door she'd been holding shut for 3 years starting to come off its hinges. The background re-verification on Adrian Cross took Danny Reese 4 days. Danny ran security the way a former military man runs everything, with systematic thoroughness and zero editorial commentary, delivering results in plain language with no recommendation attached, because Danny considered recommendations to be someone else's job. He delivered the report to Sophia on Thursday evening, a 14-page document printed on plain paper the way Danny produced everything, and she read it at her desk with the door closed. The first 11 pages were clean. Cleaner than Marcus's original check, which was already thorough, but clean. Employment history confirmed. Educational credentials confirmed. The 3 holding companies he'd worked with previously, all legitimate, all with positive outcomes attributed at least partially to his strategic involvement. Page 12 was where it started to get interesting. A civil litigation from 8 years ago, settled out of court. Plaintiff, a mid-size investment firm whose CFO had accused Adrian of manipulating internal financial models to benefit a third-party client. The case had been settled with a non-disclosure agreement and a financial payment that the NDA obscured but that Danny had estimated, from available court filings, at somewhere in the range of $400,000. The name of the third-party client, whose interests Adrian had allegedly served at the expense of the investment firm, was redacted in the public filings. Danny had found it anyway. It was a holding company registered in Delaware. The holding company, traced through 3 layers of subsidiary structure, was connected to a man named Victor Slade, a name Sophia recognized from Luca's files as a former business associate who had separated from the DeLuca organization 4 years ago under circumstances that Marcus had described to her as mutually unsatisfactory and permanently resolved. She read page 12 twice. Then page 13, which was Danny's supplemental notes, written in the clipped, declarative style of a man who had once written military intelligence reports. Subject maintains active contact with entities connected to Slade Holdings. 3 encrypted communications identified via peripheral monitoring. Dates attached. Content unverifiable. Pattern of contact inconsistent with subject's stated professional history. Active contact. 3 communications. Dates that fell within the last 2 weeks. The last 2 weeks during which Adrian Cross had been inside DeLuca Enterprises, had reviewed financials with Holt's team, had been given access to the legitimate business portfolio structure as part of his expansion mandate, had attended 3 internal briefings, had been alone with Sophia's workflow documentation for 40 minutes on his second day when she'd been called into an emergency legal review and had left her secondary workstation logged in. She sat very still for a long moment. Then she called Danny. "The workstation access on his second day," she said when he picked up. "Is there a record of what files he opened?" "Yes," Danny said. "I can have it to you in 20 minutes. It took him 16. She read the file access log and felt something cold move through the center of her chest. Adrian Cross had opened 11 files in 40 minutes. 3 of them were operational documents that would have been accessible to anyone at his clearance level. 8 of them were not. They were files from the Marchetti transaction, specifically the financial projection models that contained internal margin structures that the DeLuca organization had never disclosed to any external party. The projections that, if released, would expose the exact ratio between the legitimate business revenues and the sources of capital that funded them. Not enough to constitute a criminal case on its own, but enough, in the hands of someone who knew how to use it, to manufacture one. She picked up her phone and called Luca. I was in his office. She knew because the light was on and the door was cracked, and she could hear him on a call as she came off the elevator at 8:40 p.m., the floor empty of everyone except the overnight security rotation and a single junior analyst working late 2 offices down. She knocked on the door frame and he looked up, and something in her face made him say into the phone, "I'll call you back," and set it down. "Close the door," he said. She closed it. She put Danny's report on his desk. She put the file access log on top of it and said, "Read page 12 first." He read. I was very still while he read. The specific quality of stillness that she had learned over 3 years to distinguish from his other varieties. This was not the controlled stillness of a man managing his response. This was the stillness of a man whose mind was moving very fast through implications. He read page 12, then 13, then the access log. He did not look up until he had read every line. "Victor Slade," he said. "Yes." He's been in contact with Slade's operation since before he arrived. The dates on the communication suggest the contact predates his hire by at least 3 weeks, which means the approach to the organization, the consulting contract, was potentially arranged with access in mind. He set the papers down. He looked at her. The controlled quiet of his face had shifted into something harder and more interior, something she had seen only a few times in 3 years, and always associated with the moments when Luca DeLuca made decisions that were not reversible. He accessed the Marchetti projections, Luca said. "Yes." "Through your workstation." "Yes." She kept her voice level. The guilt in that, leaving the workstation logged in, the procedural failure that she should never have allowed. She had already processed it in the car coming up, had folded it into the shape of a fact rather than a wound, because this was not the moment for self-recrimination. 40 minutes. He pulled 8 files above his clearance level. Luca stood up. He moved to the window. Not to look at the view, she knew, but because he thought better when he was standing and the window gave him something to orient toward that wasn't the room. "He'll use the projections to fabricate a discrepancy," he said. Not asking. Thinking out loud, which he almost never did in front of anyone. Something that looks like financial fraud from the outside. Something a regulator or an investor would find compelling, or a federal investigator. He turned and looked at her. Slade has federal connections. I know. She had read enough of the files over 3 years to know that. Victor Slade has been trying to find a way into the organization's financials for 4 years. He couldn't find a legitimate angle, so he sent someone to manufacture one. Luca was looking at her with an expression that was more complex than anything she had a simple name for. There was something that looked like fury, cold, contained, the productive kind he channeled into decisions. There was something that looked like the specific sharpening that happened when a problem became concrete enough to attack. And there was something else, underneath both of those, that she noticed and filed and did not examine in this moment. You found this, he said. Danny found it. I read it. You initiated the re-verification. You asked me to. He shook his head, slightly. Not a disagreement, something else. I asked you to because of... He stopped. The reason I asked you to wasn't professional. The reason doesn't matter. The result does. He looked at her for a long moment. We have the access log, he said. We have the communications record. We don't have the content of what he transmitted. Not yet. If he's already sent the Marchetti files to Slade, then Slade has enough to build a case. Not a strong one. The projections alone aren't conclusive. But if Slade supplements them with fabricated documentation, which Danny's report suggests he has the infrastructure to do, then we're looking at a federal fraud inquiry before end of month. The word we sat in the sentence. She noticed it. He noticed it. Neither of them addressed it. We need to know what he transmitted, Luca said. And we need to know what Slade has already built. Yes. That requires access to communications we don't have legal authority to intercept. I know. He looked at her steadily. This was the edge of something. She understood that with complete clarity, that the conversation they were having was moving into territory where the next step was not a legal one, and he was giving her the opportunity to step back from it before they went further. She didn't step back. What do you need from me? She said. Something crossed his face. Something that in another context, on another face, she might have called relief. The specific release of a man who has been carrying something alone and has just been told he doesn't have to. I need 2 days, he said. Don't interact with Cross. Don't change anything in your routine. Don't give him any indication that anything has changed. And then we move. She nodded. She picked up the access log from his desk, her copy, the one she'd brought for herself, and she folded it and put it in her jacket pocket and turned toward the door. Sophia. She turned around. I was standing at the window with the city laid out behind him, and his expression was the one she still didn't have a complete name for. The one that had been building since the day he'd called her by her first name, since the coffee at 9:30 p.m., since good work on the Newark assessments, since every small thing that had been accumulating in the space between them for longer than 2 weeks and longer, she understood now, than 3 years. Thank you, he said. Not for the report. Not for the re-verification. Not for finding what she'd found. She understood that what he was thanking her for was something larger and less specific, and she felt it land in her chest with a weight that was not unwelcome. Don't thank me yet, she said. We haven't fixed it. She walked out. She was at the elevator when she heard it. Not from behind her, not from Luca's office, but from down the corridor, from the direction of the secondary conference room that should have been empty at 8:50 on a Thursday evening. A sound, small and specific. The particular soft sound of a door being carefully, deliberately, closed by someone who did not want the sound of it to carry. She stopped. She stood very still and listened. The floor was quiet. The junior analyst 2 offices down had headphones in. She could see the faint bob of his head through the glass. The overnight security was stationed at the elevator bank on 38. No one else should be on this floor. She turned and walked back down the corridor, past the kitchen, past the row of closed office doors, to the secondary conference room at the end. She put her hand on the handle and opened it. The room was empty. The chairs were around the table the way they always were. The whiteboard was clean. The credenza along the wall was undisturbed, except one of the credenza drawers was not fully closed, an inch of dark gap where it should have been flush. She crossed the room and opened it. Inchiti, a standard supply of presentation materials, markers, spare cable adapters. Everything where it should be, except a small rectangular indent in the back left corner where the foam lining of the drawer was compressed, like something had rested there recently and been removed. She stood and looked at the empty indentation in the foam. She looked at the conference room's secondary Ethernet port in the wall panel beside the credenza, the port that connected to the building's internal network, and that, unlike the wireless system, bypassed the encrypted gateway and ran directly into the server infrastructure. The port's indicator light was blinking. It should have been dark. That port had no scheduled active connections tonight. She took out her phone and called Danny Reese. Are you at your desk? She said. Yes. Pull the secondary conference room network activity. Floor 43, right now. She heard him typing. 20 seconds. There's an active connection on that port, Danny said. Started at typing. 8:22 this evening. It's still open. 8:22. 20 minutes ago. While she had been in Luca's office reading the report. While the floor had been, she had assumed, empty. Someone planted a device, she said. On the secondary port. It's transmitting right now. I can kill the connection from... Don't! Her voice came out sharp and she made herself slow down. Don't kill it. If he's monitoring the connection remotely and it drops, he'll know we found it. Let it run. She looked at the empty foam impression in the drawer. How much data has gone out? Danny was quiet for longer this time. She stood in the empty conference room with her hand on the credenza and waited. Ms. Moretti, Danny said. His voice had a quality she had never heard from Danny Reese before. Something that was almost but not quite discomfort. Danny did not do discomfort, which meant what he was looking at was bad enough to produce the first emotional response she had ever heard from him. The data volume is significant. This isn't a quick pull. Whoever set this up ran a sustained transfer, based on the packet size and the duration. What did they get, Danny? A pause. Everything, he said. The Marchetti files, the Newark assessments, the partnership structures, the holding portfolio map. And another pause, shorter, the kind that meant he was reading something and didn't want to say it. The operational calendar, 6 months back, active project files. The operational calendar. 6 months of Luca de Luca's operational movements, meeting schedules, contact networks. Not just the legitimate business. Everything that touched it, every interface point between the surface organization and the infrastructure underneath it. In the hands of Victor Slade, with a federal contact and the patience to construct a case, that calendar was not a fraud allegation. That was a prosecution. Sophia stood in the empty conference room with the blinking port light and the foam impression and Danny's voice in her ear, and she felt the specific cold of a person who has just understood that the situation they were managing has already, quietly, become something else entirely. And that the 2 days Luca had asked for, she had 2 days. She had nothing close to 2 days. She walked back down the corridor toward Luca's office with her phone still in her hand, and Danny still on the line, and her footsteps faster than she intended, not quite running but close enough that the overnight security camera would have recorded a woman who had stopped managing her own pace. She pushed open Luca's office door without knocking. I was at his desk, jacket back on his own phone. He looked up when she came in. Something in her face made him say, into his phone, hold, and lower it. The device has been running since 8:22, she said. Secondary conference room, wired directly into the internal network through the Ethernet port. It bypassed the encrypted gateway. She held his gaze. Danny says the transfer volume is significant. Marchetti files, the holding portfolio map, the operational calendar, 6 months back. The silence lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then Luca said into his phone, I'll call you back, and set it on the desk with a controlled precision that was the only external sign of what was happening inside him, and stood up. Danny, Sophia said into her phone, don't touch the port. Don't flag the device. Keep the connection live and monitor where the data is routing. It's routing through a VPN chain, Danny said. 3 nodes. I can trace it, but it'll take... Do it. Call me when you have the endpoint. She ended the call. Luca was already at the door. Where's Cross right now? He said. I don't know. Find out. He said it without looking at her because he was already moving into the corridor, and she was already pulling up the building's internal access log on her phone. The system that tracked keycard movements through every secure door on every floor. He badged out at 7:58, she said, reading from the log as she followed him. Main lobby exit. He set the device before he left. Yes. Set it running and walked out. She calculated. If the connection's still live, he may be monitoring it remotely. He may not even know we found it. If he knows we found it, he'd have killed the connection from his end. Luca stopped at the elevator bank. He turned and looked at her. The corridor light was the particular flat quality of a building running on its overnight system. Not dark, but stripped of the warmth the daytime lighting added, everything gray and clear and exposing. He looked, in this light, less like the CEO of a billion-dollar enterprise and more like what Sophia had always understood him to also be. A man who had navigated genuinely dangerous situations for long enough that the response to danger had become structural, something in the spine and the jaw and the specific flatness of his eyes when the variables stopped being theoretical. The operational calendar, he said. Yes. Slade has meeting records, contact points. He held her gaze. Names. She understood immediately what he wasn't saying. The operational calendar did not just record when Luca had attended what. It recorded the people he had met with, captains, associates, the architecture of the organization's human network, mapped in dates and times and locations over 6 months. How quickly can Slade move on that, she said. If he already has federal contacts ready to receive the information, Luca's jaw tightened. 72 hours. Maybe less. The elevator arrived. They got in. Adrian Cross needs to be found tonight, Luca said. I know. And the device needs to come off that port. If we pull the device, Slade loses the connection. He'll know we're on to him. Good. Luca. She turned to face him in the elevator, close enough that she had to look up slightly, close enough to see the tension running through the set of his shoulders. If Slade knows we found it before we have the endpoint of that data transfer, he moves the files to somewhere we can't trace. We lose the evidence that ties Cross to the operation. We lose the chain of custody. Whatever we build against him becomes circumstantial. He looked at her. The elevator moved. You want to leave it running, he said. I want Danny to have enough time to trace the endpoint. If we can identify where the data is being received, we have a direct line to Slade's infrastructure. That's not just evidence against Cross. That's enough to dismantle whatever Slade has built against you. She paused. But it means the transfer continues for however long Danny needs. How long? She called Danny back. How long to trace the endpoint? Clean trace with no counter detection? Danny said. 3 hours minimum. If they have active monitoring on the route, could be longer, could trip a flag. 3 hours, she told Luca. He looked at the elevator doors. His reflection in the brushed metal was dark and partial, the version of a face rather than a face. 3 hours, he said. Yes. The doors opened on the lobby. He walked out and stopped and turned. Find Cross, he said. Tonight. I don't care how. She found him at 10:43 p.m. It was not sophisticated. She called the hotel concierge at the 4 properties within a half-mile radius of the DeLuca building. Adrian had mentioned, in a side conversation 2 weeks ago, that he preferred to stay walking distance from wherever he was working. And on the 3rd call, she reached a property where the front desk, after the right combination of corporate account reference and the specific authority that lived in Sophia's voice when she decided to use it fully, confirmed that yes, Mr. Cross was a guest, and yes, his room phone would be available. She called the room. He picked up on the 2nd ring. I need to see you, she said. Tonight. A pause. Short. She could hear him recalibrating, the small shift of a man who had been operating on one set of assumptions being handed information that complicated them. It's nearly 11, he said. I know what time it is. There's something you need to understand before tomorrow. She let a beat land. About the re-verification report. Another pause. Longer. Where? He said. Lobby bar. 20 minutes. She called Danny from the car. How's the trace? 90 minutes in, making progress. The chain's running through Frankfurt and then Singapore. I should have the endpoint within the hour. Keep going. She paused. And Danny, pull the access footage from the secondary conference room. I want to know exactly when Cross entered, what he brought in, and what his hands were doing. I pulled it 20 minutes ago. Of course he had. And? He went in at 8:19, stayed 4 minutes, came in with his briefcase, left without it, then came back at 8:40 and left with it again. A pause. The device was in the briefcase. He planted it, let it initialize, and came back to collect the hardware once the transfer was running autonomously. Clean operation. He's done this before. She sat with that for a moment. He's done this before. The civil litigation from 8 years ago. The investment firm. The manipulated financial models. Not an isolated incident. A methodology. A man who had spent years refining a specific kind of infiltration. The car stopped outside the hotel. She got out. The lobby bar was low-lit and mostly empty at this hour. The Thursday night crowd thinned to a bartender, a couple in a corner, and 2 men at the far end of the bar who were not together and were both looking at their phones. Adrian was already there when Sophia arrived, sitting at a small table with a glass of water in front of him and his jacket on, which meant he hadn't been upstairs and come down. He'd been somewhere in the hotel already. She sat down. She did not take off her coat. He looked at her. His face was composed in the way it always was. That pleasant, attentive neutrality that she now understood was not openness but its opposite. A surface maintained with professional discipline, the way a kept room looks unoccupied. You ran a re-verification, he said. Not a question. Yes. And you found the litigation? Yes. He leaned back slightly, picked up his water glass, held it without drinking, set it down. That was 8 years ago, and it was settled. It's not... I also found the encrypted communications with Slade's operation, she said, and the file access log from your second day, and the device you planted in the secondary conference room at 8:19 tonight. Something happened to his face. Very small, very fast. A shift that lasted less than a second and was gone before it fully formed. The specific involuntary response of a man whose prepared position has just been rendered irrelevant. Then the composure reset. She watched it reset, watched him make the decision to stay in the room rather than leave it, and understood that he was now calculating rather than reacting, which made him more dangerous in this moment than he would have been if he'd panicked. You're good, he said, quietly, almost appreciative. I know. Does DeLuca know? What do you think? He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, the device is running whether you pulled it or not. The data is already in transit. Whatever you found it too late to stop the transfer. Maybe, she said, or maybe we've been tracing the endpoint for the last 2 hours, and in about 40 minutes, we'll have a direct line to every piece of infrastructure Slade has built for this operation. The composure held, but his right hand, flat on the table, pressed down slightly. A small increase in pressure she would not have noticed if she hadn't spent 3 years reading minute physical signals in a man who made an art form of concealment. She had landed something. You're bluffing, he said. Am I? He studied her. She let him study her. She kept her breathing even and her face open and her hands relaxed on the table, and she gave him nothing. The way 3 years of working for Luca DeLuca had taught her to give nothing when giving nothing was the move. Victor Slade is not someone you want as an enemy, Adrian said. The register of his voice had changed, not threatening exactly, something more like a man conveying practical information. He has resources that go beyond what DeLuca's operation can counter. The federal connections alone. I'm not interested in what Slade has, she said. I'm interested in what you have. Specifically, the original files, the unmodified Marchetti projections, the unaltered holding portfolio documentation, the versions that exist before whatever fabrication Slade is planning to run against them. He was quiet. You made copies, she said, before you sent them. That's standard operational practice for someone who's done this before. You don't hand your leverage to the client without keeping your own insurance. She watched him. If Slade goes down, she said, and we have enough to take him down completely, what happens to someone who cooperated with that process is a very different story from what happens to someone we have to drag into it. She paused. I'm giving you a window. It's a small one, and it closes when I leave this table. The bar was quiet around them. The couple in the corner laughed softly at something. The bartender wiped down the counter with a cloth. Adrian Cross looked at her for a long time. Then he said, the files are on an encrypted drive. Local storage, not cloud. I can have it to you by midnight. I'll be in the lobby, she said. Not your room. Here. He nodded. He stood up. He was almost to the elevator when he stopped and turned back. He doesn't deserve you, Adrian said. Not vindictive, just stated with the flat quality of a man leaving a last piece of genuine opinion on the table before the door closed. DeLuca. He doesn't know what he has. She looked at him. That's not your concern. He went to the elevator. She called Danny the moment he was out of sight. Tell me you have the endpoint. 19 minutes ago, Danny said. It's a server farm outside Newark registered to a shell company. 3 layers out from Slade Holdings, but I can close the chain. I also got the receiving account credentials. Whoever's monitoring on Slade's end hasn't changed the default authentication. I'm in. She closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Can you see what they have? Everything they received tonight. I can also see what they've already built. Miss Moretti? The Danny discomfort quality again. Heavier this time. The fabricated documentation is already in construction. They have a forensic accounting firm on retainer. They were planning to file within 96 hours. 96 hours. 4 days. Luca had been right about the timeline, but not the direction. It was already moving, had already been moving, had been in motion since before Adrian Cross walked into the building's first Monday briefing. Danny, she said, preserve everything. Every file, every record, every fabricated document in construction. I need a complete package. She paused. and kill the incoming connection from the device. Do it now. Killing it. She sat in the lobby bar and breathed. Her phone buzzed. Luca. She picked up. Where are you? He said. Hotel lobby. Adrian Cross is bringing me the original files, and she checked the time. 30 minutes. Unmodified versions. Physical drive. She paused. Danny has the Slade endpoint. He's inside the receiving server. We have their fabricated documentation, their timeline, their accounting firm connection. We have everything we need. A silence. Different from Luca's usual silences. Something in this one that she felt rather than analyzed. You got him to turn over the files, Luca said. Yes. How? I offered him a better option than the alternative. She paused. And I told him the truth, that we already had enough. Did we? We do now. Another silence. Come back to the building when you have the drive, he said. Tonight. I know, she said. She sat in the lobby and waited, and at 12:08 a.m., Adrian Cross came back downstairs with his jacket on and his briefcase, and he sat across from her and opened the briefcase on the table between them and produced a small black encrypted drive and set it down. The decryption key is on a card inside a sealed envelope in the side pocket, he said. Don't open the envelope until you're in a secured environment. She picked up the drive. The weight of it was nothing, 30 grams maybe. The weight of everything built against Luca de Luca on a piece of hardware small enough to close her fist around. What happens to me now? Adrian said. She looked at him. She thought about what she'd read in Danny's report, about the investment firm 8 years ago, the $400,000 settlement, the NDA, the methodology refined across a decade into what had just been deployed inside the De Luca organization. That's not my decision to make, she said, but the fact that you cooperated will be part of whatever conversation happens next. He nodded. He picked up his briefcase. He stood. For what it's worth, he said, I didn't enjoy this one. He paused. You made it harder than it was supposed to be. Good, she said. He walked out of the hotel and into the Manhattan midnight, and she watched the door close behind him and sat for one moment with the drive in her hand before she stood up and buttoned her coat and walked out into the cold. The black car was at the curb. She got in and said 43rd floor, and her phone rang immediately. Not Luca, not Danny, but a number she didn't recognize, and she let it ring out, and then it rang again, and this time she answered, Ms. Moretti. A man's voice. Older, precise, with the particular diction of someone who had been educated expensively and knew it. My name isn't important. I represent Victor Slade's interests. We're aware you've been in contact with Mr. Cross tonight, and I want to offer you an opportunity to step back from a situation that doesn't have to involve you personally. She said nothing. Mr. Slade's issue is with Luca de Luca, the voice continued, not with you. You're a recent hire in a new role. You have no personal exposure here. If you choose to step away from whatever you're currently carrying, a pause, knowing, deliberate, we can ensure that your career continues in a direction that doesn't end with you connected to a federal investigation. The car was moving through the empty late-night grid of Midtown. The lights were amber and red, and the streets were wet from the day's earlier rain, and the city outside the window looked exactly like itself, indifferent and enormous and lit from within. She looked at the drive in her hand. She thought about the coffee at 9:30 p.m. She thought about good work on the Newark assessments. She thought about an elevator in which she had pressed her hand flat against the wall and felt the whole city vibrating around her. She thought about the morning she had written Elena's wedding in red ink and made a decision about what she was and was not willing to sacrifice for a man who had not yet learned to see her. She thought about all of that. Then she thought about the 43rd floor at 7 in the morning with the city below and the work in front of her and Luca's office light already on when she stepped off the elevator, and the specific feeling that she had been working toward something for 3 years without being willing to name what it was. She knew what it was. She had known for a long time. No, she said. She ended the call. The car pulled up in front of the De Luca building. She got out. She crossed the lobby without slowing and rode the elevator to the 43rd floor and walked the empty corridor to Luca's office and pushed the door open. He was at his desk. Jacket off, collar open, the controlled exhaustion of a man who had been running on sharp attention for 6 hours and was still running. He looked up when she came in. She crossed the room and set the drive on his desk between them. He looked at it, then at her. Slade called, she said. Someone from his side. Offered me an exit. Personal immunity, career continuity. She held his gaze. I said no. The thing that moved across Luca de Luca's face in that moment was something she had never seen there before. Not the controlled professional appreciation, not the layered, ambiguous quality she'd been parsing for 3 years. Something stripped of all of that. Something that lived below the architecture of the man he had constructed himself to be, and had, in this moment, come to the surface without his permission. He stood up. He came around the desk. He stopped in front of her, close. Closer than the professional distance they had maintained for 3 years. Close enough that she could see the exhaustion in the lines around his eyes, and the specific way he was breathing, and she understood with complete clarity that the distance was gone. That the 2 weeks since her return had been the slow dissolution of something that had been dissolving for much longer than 2 weeks. And what was standing in front of her now was not the CEO, not the boss, not the feared and untouchable kingpin whose name alone could silence a room. It was just Luca. Sophia, he said. She had just enough time to think, here it is, this is the moment, this is where everything changes before. His hands came up and held her face, and he kissed her. Not the way she might have imagined it in the 3 years she had been carefully not imagining it. Not careful or tentative or weighted with the significance of everything it represented. Just direct and certain and warm, with the specific quality of something that had been held in compression for a very long time and had finally, quietly, been released. She stood still for exactly 1 second. Then she kissed him back. His hands were against her jaw, thumbs at her cheekbones, and she had her fingers curled into the front of his shirt without deciding to put them there. And the drive was sitting on the desk behind them, and the city was outside the windows doing what the city always did. And none of it mattered at all for the length of that kiss. When they separated, it was by inches. He kept his forehead against hers. His eyes were closed. She could feel him breathing. I should have said it months ago, he said. Very quiet. The register of a man who was not performing honesty, but simply doing it, which was different and rarer and considerably more difficult to defend against. You should have said it 3 years ago, she said. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. She felt it more than heard it. The specific vibration of a man who hadn't laughed, really laughed, in long enough that the reflex had gotten rusty. Yes, he said, 3 years ago. She stepped back. Not away. Just enough to see his face, to read the thing that was living there now, that he'd stopped managing it. He looked tired. Tired in the deep way. The way that had nothing to do with the hours he'd worked tonight, and everything to do with how long he'd been carrying what he'd been carrying. She picked up the drive from the desk. We're not finished, she said. He straightened. The exhaustion did not go away, but it reorganized, moved back, made room. He reached for his jacket. No, he said. We're not. Marcus arrived at the building at 1:22 a.m. He arrived because Sophia had called him 40 minutes earlier and said 3 sentences. I need you at the building. I have the Slade endpoint and the original files. Bring whoever you trust most in the legal structure. Marcus had said, I'll be there in 40 minutes, and arrived in 38, which was Marcus at the outer edge of what he considered acceptable urgency. He came with 2 people. Elena Park, the organization's senior outside counsel, who was compact and precise, and had a face that communicated nothing except when she was in a courtroom, at which point it communicated everything she needed it to. And a man named Robert Finch, whom Sophia had never met, but whom Marcus introduced as their forensic accounting specialist, meaning the man who could look at a set of financial records and read the manipulation in them the way a doctor reads a scan, not theoretically, but in the practical evidentiary language that held up in front of people who needed to be convinced. They assembled in the main conference room. Luca sat at the head of the table. Sophia sat 2 seats down with her laptop open and the drive connected and decrypted, and she walked them through it. The access log, the device, the data transfer, Danny's trace to the Newark server farm, the fabricated documentation already in construction on Slade's end, and Adrian Cross's cooperation, the original unmodified files now sitting on the drive. Elena Park listened with her hands flat on the table and her face doing nothing except processing. Robert Finch looked at the files on Sophia's screen with the specific attention of someone who has found what he was looking for and is now cataloging its dimensions. The fabricated documentation, Finch said. Can you get me direct access to what's on the Slade server right now? Danny has the credentials, Sophia said. She called Danny, who patched the access through to Finch's laptop within 4 minutes. Finch looked at the screen for 40 seconds. Then he said, They altered the depreciation schedules on the Newark properties, changed the booking dates on 3 of the Marchetti capital contributions, and he leaned closer. They inserted a series of wire transfer records that don't exist in the actual ledger. These are designed to look like undisclosed payments to offshore entities. He looked up. If a federal investigator saw this without the original documentation for comparison, it would look like textbook fraud. How long to build the comparison document? Elena said. Original versus fabricated. Something that demonstrates the manipulation clearly enough to use as a defense against whatever Slade files. With the originals on this drive? Finch looked at the screen. 6 hours. Maybe 5. Start now, Luca said. Finch started. Elena turned to Luca. The communications record between Cross and Slade's operation. The encrypted messages Danny flagged. We need those authenticated and preserved as evidence. If Slade moves first and files before we have a complete package, we need to be able to demonstrate conspiracy to fabricate rather than just fabricate. That's the difference between a defense and a counterattack. Danny can authenticate them, Sophia said. He has the metadata chain. I'll have him prepare the documentation. The federal contact Slade has, Elena said. Do we know who? Not yet, Luca said. We need to know. Elena's voice was flat and precise and did not editorialize. Not for the civil case, for the criminal exposure. If Slade has a federal contact who's been primed to receive this information, we need to know whether that contact has already been compromised, meaning whether they're a willing participant in a manufactured case or whether they're an investigator who has received fabricated information in good faith. She paused. The legal strategy is entirely different depending on which it is. The room was quiet for a moment, except for the sound of Finch's fingers on his keyboard and the faint hum of the building's overnight HVAC. Sophia looked at Luca. He was looking at Marco, who had arrived 20 minutes after Marcus and had been sitting at the far end of the table with his silver hair and his laced fingers, contributing nothing, which was exactly what Marco did when he was thinking hardest. Marco, Luca said. I heard her. Marco unfolded his hands. The federal contact is someone named Harrington. Kevin Harrington, Assistant Section Chief, Financial Crimes Division. He and Slade have a history. Harrington investigated one of Slade's businesses 4 years ago, and the case was dropped for insufficient evidence. Slade has been cultivating him since. He paused. Harrington is not a corrupt investigator. He is an investigator who believes he has a genuine case against the DeLuca organization and has been carefully fed information designed to reinforce that belief. The room absorbed this. How do you know his name? Luca said. Marco looked at him with the specific patience of a man who has been answering this kind of question for decades. Because I have been watching Victor Slade for 4 years since he separated from this organization, and I did not watch him casually. Another silence. You knew Slade was building something, Sophia said. I suspected. I did not have evidence. Marco looked at her with something in his eyes that was as close to an apology as Marco produced. When you initiated the re-verification on Cross, I understood what it meant. I began moving information about Harrington to a position where it would be useful. He looked at Luca. I should have shared what I had earlier. I did not because I was not certain, and I do not operate on uncertainty. Luca looked at him for a long moment. Not angry, or not only angry, something more complicated. Next time, Luca said. Yes, Marco said. Simply and without additional qualification, which from Marco constituted the most complete acknowledgement available. The next 4 hours were the kind of work that Sophia understood at a cellular level, the specific quality of sustained urgent problem-solving that required every available cognitive resource deployed simultaneously and without the luxury of being careful about it. She moved between Finch's analysis and Danny's authentication documentation and Elena's legal strategy framework, coordinating the pieces with the focused velocity that had always been her most natural mode of operating, the mode she'd spent 3 years applying to Luca DeLuca's empire and was now applying for the first time with the full weight of what that empire meant to her personally as well as professionally. She was aware of Luca at the edges of this, moving through the room, handling the operational communications she was not involved in, the calls to the people in the organization's structure who needed to be informed and positioned before morning. His presence was consistent and quiet and had the particular quality, she noticed this, filed it, returned to work, of a man who was watching something he trusted operate at its full capacity and was, for the first time in memory, letting it do so without inserting himself into every mechanism. He had always run everything through himself. Every decision, every approval, every point of control held personally. That was the architecture of the DeLuca operation. Not delegated, not distributed, but centralized in one man's judgment, because that man's judgment had been, for long enough, the only thing he trusted. He was not running this through himself. He had given it to her. She felt that understanding move through her at 3:47 a.m. while she was reading the third page of Elena's draft legal brief, and it moved through her without ceremony. Not as a revelation exactly, but as the arrival of something she had been watching approach for a long time. At 4:15 a.m., Finch looked up from his laptop and said, "I have it." The comparison document was 42 pages. Original records annotated side by side with the fabricated versions, every manipulation flagged, every altered entry dated and sourced. The forensic chain of evidence assembled with the methodical completeness of a man who had done this in litigation contexts and knew exactly what a skeptical examiner would look for. Elena read it in 11 minutes. She read the way she apparently did everything, with complete efficiency and zero visible reaction until she had finished, at which point she set it down and said, "This is sufficient. With the authentication records from your IT team and the original files from Cross, this is a complete defense package. More than defense. This is grounds for criminal conspiracy charges against Slade and potentially against Cross depending on his cooperation agreement." "He cooperated fully," Sophia said. "He handed over the drive voluntarily and provided decryption without conditions. I'll need a statement from him, tonight if possible." Elena looked at the clock. This morning, Sophia called Adrian Cross's hotel room at 4:23 a.m. He answered on the first ring, which meant he hadn't been sleeping, which meant he'd been waiting for this call or something like it, sitting in a hotel room in the Manhattan pre-dawn, making whatever interior accounting a man makes when he has just chosen one path over another and cannot yet see where it leads. He came to the building at 5:05 a.m. and gave his statement to Elena Park with the flat, cooperative precision of a man fulfilling the terms of a decision he'd already made and was not going to revisit. He did not look at Luca during any of it, which was a kind of discretion Sophia noted and respected. When it was done, Elena said, "Stay in the city. Don't contact Slade's people. Don't attempt to access anything connected to this matter." She paused. "Your cooperation will be factored into whatever follows." Adrian nodded. He looked at Sophia once, briefly, at the door. She looked back at him with the even, professional attention she had always given him, and he walked out. And she understood that the door had closed cleanly behind him. Not dramatically, not with the weight of things unresolved, but with the specific finality of something that had served a purpose and completed it. She was glad she'd said no to lunch. She was glad she'd said no to his for now. She was glad, in the way of someone who has reached the end of a very complicated route and can now see the whole map from the high ground, that she had known the difference between the thing Adrian Cross offered, which was straightforward and surface level, and would have been fine for a less specific version of herself, and the thing she had been protecting space for without being willing to name it. She knew its name now, Sud. Harrington received the complete package at 7:30 a.m. via Elena Park's office, delivered by courier with a cover letter that was 4 paragraphs long and said, in the precise language of someone who had been doing this for 20 years, exactly what the enclosed materials demonstrated, what the implications were for the investigation he had been building, and what he would find if he examined the provenance of the information he had received from sources connected to Victor Slade's organization. Elena had said the night before that Harrington was not a corrupt man. She had said he was an investigator who believed he had a genuine case and had been carefully managed toward that belief. At 9:14 a.m., his office called Elena back. At 9:47 a.m., federal agents executed a search warrant on the Newark server farm that housed Slade's fabricated documentation. At 11:30 a.m., Victor Slade was taken into federal custody on charges that included conspiracy to obstruct justice, fabrication of financial evidence, and criminal conspiracy, charges built, with clean forensic precision, from the exact infrastructure he had spent 4 years constructing to use against someone else. Sophia was at her desk when Marcus walked in and told her, in his characteristic 2 sentences with no editorial content. She nodded. She sat with it for a moment, the specific quiet of something large resolving, not triumphant, just complete. The way a structure settles when the last piece is placed and you can feel, through the whole of it, that it will hold. She thought about Elena's wedding, about standing in a bridal party in an emerald dress holding flowers she'd set down carefully when the vows began, watching her sister look at a man who loved her with the uncomplicated, open-faced certainty of someone who had never tried to hide what he felt. Sophia had watched that and thought she was observing something in a language she almost spoke. She spoke it now. She understood now, with the full precision of a woman who dealt in clarity that she always had. Luca found her at her desk at noon. The building had resumed its normal operation around them. Morning briefings completed. The Marchetti post-close documentation filed. The board presentation rescheduled to next Thursday. The 43rd floor running at its usual efficient hum, as though the previous 20 hours had been absorbed and processed and the machinery had moved on. He closed her office door. He sat in the chair across from her desk. The same chair where clients sat, where Marcus sat for reviews, where she had sat 3 years ago for her first interview with a man who had not looked at her for the first 4 minutes of the meeting and had offered her the job in one sentence at the end of it. He looked at her now. "How are you?" he said. It was such a simple question, such a plain, human question, from a man who had not historically asked it and meant it. She felt it land with a weight that was disproportionate to its size, the way small, true things sometimes were. "Tired," she said. "Fine. Both." He nodded. He was quiet for a moment, looking at his hands, which were flat on his thighs in the thinking posture she knew, and then he looked up. "I want to talk about last night," he said. "Not the operation. The other thing. Okay? I've been trying to find the right way to say this for—" He stopped. Restarted. "I'm not good at this. You know that. It's not an excuse, it's a fact, and I'm aware it's a fact that has cost you things it shouldn't have." He held her gaze. "I shut people out because it was easier than the alternative. Easier than another stop, and this one was different. Was the stop of a man pressing through something that genuinely resisted." She waited. She did not help him. Not because she was being unkind, but because this was something he needed to say in his own words, and any assistance she offered would make it easier to leave some of it behind. "Easier than caring about something I could lose," he said. "I've lost things, people. I'm not asking for sympathy about that. I'm explaining a pattern that produced a way of operating that treated you like a function rather than a person, and I'm telling you that was wrong, and that the way I felt about you for—" He paused, a shorter pause, steadier, "for more than 2 years, was something I managed by converting it into operational value, into how much I needed you professionally, which is real, but it was not the whole of it." The office was quiet around them. Outside the windows, Manhattan was doing its midday thing, the particular quality of light that fell on the city between noon and 2, that hard, bright winter light that made everything look clarified and slightly ruthless. "I know," Sophia said. He looked at her. "I knew," she said. "Not at the beginning, but for a long time." She folded her hands on her and looked at him with the directness she had always had. The directness that was not aggression, but just the refusal to look at something important sideways. "I managed it the same way you did. I called it professionalism. I called it the job. And some of it was, the work was real, what I built here was real, and I don't want to reduce 3 years to an unprocessed feeling. But yes, I knew." "Then why didn't you—" "Because you were my employer," she said. "Because the power differential was real. And I wasn't going to be the person who introduced that into a working relationship where it couldn't be managed cleanly. Because I had watched you run an entire organization on control and distance, and I did not believe for most of those 3 years that you were capable of this conversation." He absorbed that. She watched him absorb it. Not defensively, not with the management of reaction she'd seen from him for years, but with the straightforward willingness to hold something true, even when it was uncomfortable. "Are you capable of it?" she asked. "Not the conversation, the rest of it. What comes after the conversation?" He looked at her for a long moment. "I don't know," he said. "That's the honest answer. I know what I want. I know that what I want is specific, not abstract. You, specifically, in a way that is not professional and is not manageable, and has not responded to 3 years of my best efforts to convert it into something more convenient." He paused. "Whether I'm capable of the version of myself that deserves that, I think that's something that gets answered over time, not in a conversation." Sophia looked at him. at the tiredness around his eyes and the set of his jaw, and the specific, unfamiliar quality of a man sitting in a chair without any of his usual architecture around him. No authority, no operational distance, no professional frame to give the interaction a category that could be filed and managed. Just Luca. Yes, she said. He looked at her. Yes, what? Yes, that's how it gets answered. She held his gaze. Over time. Understood. She watched him understand. Watched something in his expression settle, not into relief exactly, but into the specific quality of a decision made after long resistance, the way a held breath is finally let go. He stood up. She stood up. He came around her desk and he stood in front of her in the midday light. And she looked up at him and he said quietly, I'm going to need you to have patience with me. I know, she said. You're going to need to earn it. I know, he said. He raised his hand and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear with a carefulness that was entirely unlike the man who had told her to sit, told her to cancel her flight, told her she wouldn't walk back through his door. It was the carefulness of a man learning a new register, of someone for whom tenderness was a recently discovered country and who was navigating it without a map and without the performance of confidence he brought to everything else. She let him. The weeks that followed were not simple. She had not expected them to be. Luca was difficult in the small, daily ways that mattered more than the large ones, the reflex toward control that lived in him like a structural feature, that surfaced not in big moments, but in the accumulated small ones, the meeting where he overrode her decision without discussion and then caught himself and backed out of it, and the backing out cost him something visible. The morning she arrived before him, and he was not on the floor, and the absence of his light was strange in a way that was entirely new information about herself. The dinner they shared at a restaurant 4 blocks from the building where they did not talk about work for the first time in 3 years, and the conversation was different in quality. Not worse, not awkward, but raw in the way of something that has had its surface removed and is operating without the professional insulation they had both used for so long. She caught him checking her calendar once. Not the lobby cameras, her operational calendar, looking at her schedule for the week, the way he had always done when she worked for him without a title that reflected what she actually was. She stood in his office doorway and looked at him, and he looked back at her and said, old habit, with the flat self-awareness that passed, for him, as humor. New rules, she said. Yes, he said. She did not perform patience with him. She had told him he would need to earn it, and she meant that. And there were moments when she held a line with him the way she had held the line in the conference room the night she walked out. Not combatively, not with the edge of 3 years of managed frustration, but with the steady clarity of a woman who knew the difference between acceptable difficulty and the kind that asked her to make herself smaller. He listened. Not perfectly. Not without occasionally reverting, without the occasional moment of old architecture surfacing. But he listened in the way that mattered, with the evidence of it in his behavior over time, in the decisions he made, in the ones he brought to her rather than making alone. That was how it got answered. 4 months after the night with the drive and the lobby bar and the pre-dawn conference room and the first kiss at midnight in a 43rd floor office, Elena Park filed the last of the civil proceedings connected to the Slade matter. Victor Slade's federal case was moving through the system with the particular grinding slowness of federal prosecution, but it was moving, and the evidence package assembled across those 5 hours between midnight and dawn was its backbone. Adrian Cross had cooperated fully with both the civil and federal investigations. He was not charged. He was no longer in New York. Sophia received a single email from him 3 months after the night in the hotel lobby. 4 lines, no subject heading, saying only that he had taken a position in London, that he hoped things were well, and that he stood by what he'd said. She was better than what she'd been working with. She read it twice, deleted it, and went back to work. The legitimate side of the De Luca empire had grown. Under Sophia's operational leadership, 2 new partnership structures had been formalized. The Newark portfolio had been restructured with the clarity of documentation that could withstand the most thorough scrutiny, and the board had authorized an expansion into 2 new markets that Sophia had been quietly building the case for since her 2nd week as chief of operations. The organization was cleaner than it had been. It would never be simple, she understood that, had always understood that, had made her peace with the layered complexity of the world she'd chosen to work in. But it was moving in a direction, and the direction was partly her work, and she was not going to minimize that. One evening in early spring, she and Luca were in his office late. Not unusually late by the standards of their history together. But the quality of late had changed, the way many things had changed in ways that were not dramatic but were persistent and real. The city outside the windows was doing the thing it did in early spring, that particular quality of Manhattan when the cold is breaking and the light stays longer and the whole enormous machine of the city seems to exhale. I was at his desk. She was on the couch with her laptop, reviewing the draft of the next quarter's expansion proposal, marking sections with the shorthand annotations she'd developed over years, and that he had once told her were illegible to anyone else, which she'd considered a personal achievement. He said, "Elena's in Miami this weekend." Sophia looked up. "For her 6-month anniversary," she said. "Peter planned the whole thing. He didn't tell her where they were going until this morning." Luca looked at her across the room. "She married someone who planned surprises." "She married someone who wanted to make her happy," Sophia said. "The surprises are a method, not the point." I was quiet for a moment. He set down the pen he'd been holding, and he looked at her with the expression she had finally named 4 months in the simple, precise language it deserved. He loved her. That was the expression. It had always been the expression. She had just lacked the context to read it clearly for 3 years because the context was something he had worked very hard not to provide. "I've been thinking," he said. "I know," she said. "You've been thinking for 3 days. You do a specific thing with your jaw when you've been thinking and haven't said it yet." He looked at her for a moment, something moving through his expression that was the rueful version of the thing she'd named. "I want to build something different," he said. "I have spent 20 years building something I was proud of that was also, in some fundamental way, built on things I don't want to pass forward." He paused. "The legitimate side of what we've built, what you've built this year, that's different. That's something I can look at and see a future in, not just a structure, a future." She set her laptop aside. "What are you asking?" she said. He stood up. He came around the desk, and he crossed the room and sat beside her on the couch. Not the desk, not the professional distance, just beside her, close enough that she could see the full complexity of his face in the evening light, everything that was tired and difficult and real about it, and everything that was, underneath all of that, simply him. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. He held the ring in his hand. He did not make a speech. He was not a man who made speeches. He looked at her and he said, "I know I am not easy. I know the version of me you've agreed to is a work in progress, and that the work is yours as much as mine. I know that what I'm asking you to take on is not simple, and that you know exactly what it is because you have been inside it for 3 years, and you did not look away." He held her gaze. "I'm asking you to stay," he said. "Not as chief of operations, not as the person who holds this organization together, as," a pause, "the hard kind, the kind that cost him, as the person I come home to, as the person I am trying every day to be worth." The office was quiet. The city was outside doing what it always did, enormous and indifferent and lit from within. Sophia looked at the ring. She looked at his face. She thought about the elevator doors closing on a Friday night with her hand shaking and the knowledge that she had just burned down 3 years. And she thought about the morning she had signed the contract with a pen she'd had for 6 years. And she thought about a hotel lobby at midnight with a black drive in her hand and a man's voice on the phone offering her an exit she didn't take. She thought about why she hadn't taken it. She already knew. She took the ring from his hand. She put it on herself, not waiting for him to do it, because she was not a woman who waited for things to be done for her when she was capable of doing them herself. And he knew that about her and loved it. She understood now, specifically and completely. She looked at him. "You already are," she said. He looked at her hand, then at her face. Something in him that had been held tight for a very long time, for longer than 3 years, for longer than she had known him, for the whole of whatever difficult history had constructed the man who ran an empire on control and distance because it was easier than the alternative, released. Not dramatically, just steadily, like a breath. He raised her hand and pressed his mouth against her knuckles, against the ring, against the specific evidence of a decision she had made with full knowledge of every variable. Outside the windows, Manhattan held its spring evening light for another hour before the dark came in. Inside the office on the 43rd floor, the work would continue tomorrow. The expansion proposals, the board meetings, the 1,000 daily decisions that kept an organization alive and moving forward. She would be there for all of it. Not because she had to be, not because someone had told her to be, because she had chosen it, with full clarity, with her eyes open and her hands steady, and the complete, uncomplicated knowledge of what the choice meant. She had walked away once. She had come back on her own terms. Everything built after that, the work, the empire, the life, the love, was built on that foundation, and that foundation held. That was enough. That was everything.